Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family.
All right, let's get into the message this morning. We're still in Peter, and interesting story I want to start with. One of the greatest Christian theologians of the 20th century was a man named Karl Barth. Interesting guy. One day he was having a conversation with a very distinguished astronomer. And during their discussion, the astronomer said, Dr. Barth, I think all religions can be summed up in a very simple sentence. And this claim, of course, fascinated Karl Barth because he had spent a long part of his life, dedicating himself to the Christian faith and explaining that with very big books. And so he asked him, really, you can sum up all religions in one simple sentence? Well, what is it? And he says, well, basically, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Barth said, this is very interesting. I believe that all astronomy can be summed up in one simple sentence too. And of course, he was shocked by this, like, wow, what's one simple sentence that could sum up all astronomy? And so he asked Dr. Barth, what is that simple sentence? He said, well, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder how you are, what you are. And so, some things are simple to explain and easy to understand. Other things are more complex. And part of the message that we're getting into today, or the text that we're getting to, can become very complex. And so it will start off rather simple, and we'll drill down a little deeper into some of the complexities that we face when it comes to one of the topics that we're hitting today, which is government, respecting government. So this should be fun. I think it comes at a very interesting time in our history, and it's good to talk about. So, and the topic we're going to talk about, when we talk about government, books have been written, dissertations have been written, thousands upon books and dissertations, weeding through the complexities of this conversation. And so we're just going to kind of scratch the surface this morning, but there's been a lot said, and there's good theologians on different viewpoints in this. But again, we're in 1 Peter this morning. Very short letter in the New Testament. And remember, Peter is writing to a group of Christians, rather newer Christians, that are feeling the hostilities of living in this world. That as followers of Jesus, they have stopped worshiping the emperor. They have stopped calling him Lord and God. And so the larger Roman Empire and community is like, we don't understand them. And that Roman community is putting pressure on them because they're not doing the things they used to do as far as worshiping the emperor and offering sacrifices and things of that nature. And I imagine their families also are a little upset with them because they're not doing some of the family traditions that they had been doing that, of course, go against the Christian faith. So they pulled back from that, and their families are also a bit upset and putting some pressure on them to conform to the standards that they once used to conform to. And so they're feeling this pressure, they're feeling this persecution, whether it's verbal or maybe being marginalized, made fun of, and even in cases of physical abuse. And so they're going through this. And in this text that we're getting into today, Peter's really encouraging them to live with integrity. And specifically to live in integrity because people are watching us, as just the same as today. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12 says this, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. That they may see your good deeds and glorify God. And he's talking about integrity. How do our lives look to those around us? Are we living with integrity? We are being watched all the time. And there's three specific areas that Peter touches on here in which we're being watched. And so the three areas are temptation, authority, and suffering. So these are three areas that if we want to live with integrity, Peter is saying these are the areas we need to be careful in. And he's basically saying we need to resist temptation, and we need to respect authority, and we need to run to God in suffering. And so this is what my message is about this morning. We're going to talk briefly about resisting temptation and briefly about running to God in suffering, and probably most of our time will be spent on respecting authority. So let's jump into the first one, resisting temptation. In verse 11, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." He's talking about resisting temptation. And he makes this comment as foreigners and exiles. Now, there's two ways this can be taken, and I mentioned this in the first message that I did on 1 Peter. It could be literally that they were not citizens where they were living, that they didn't have that status, and they weren't illegal citizens, but they were there, they didn't have citizenship. And you know, as not being a citizen, you don't have the same rights. I remember in the book of Acts when Paul had been beaten by Roman soldiers, they didn't realize he's a Roman citizen, and then they're like, oh no, now we're in trouble. We've beaten a Roman citizen when we were not allowed to do that without cause, without due process. And so they were in fear of getting in trouble. So citizens do have certain rights that non-citizens don't have. And so maybe they were living as foreigners and exiles, kind of on the margins of this society, maybe not having all the rights of the others that were there. Or maybe Paul was meaning it figuratively, that we are not citizens of this world, but we are first citizens of heaven, citizens of the kingdom of God. We're simply passing through. Either way, the truth is we are passing through. We shouldn't get too comfortable in this world that we're living in and just blend in, that God has called us to live differently. And so that's what he's talking about here. And then he says to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. And I would say that this culture wages war against our soul, that it wants us to conform to the mold of our society and live just like everybody else. But as we know, God has called us to live differently, and Peter in this letter is calling them to live differently, that they should live with integrity. They should live differently than the world around them. And so he says, abstain from sinful desires, that we should resist them. In fact, we should just run from them. When we see temptation lurking, when we see sin crouching, we should go the opposite direction. We should resist it. We should run. We should flee. We should stick on our running shoes, our Nike Airs, and start running in the opposite direction. We should resist it and not be conformed to this world. So if something tempts us, we run the other direction. He's talking about resisting temptation. And he goes on here, and he says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, notice that they couldn't find anything that they were doing wrong, but they accused them of doing wrong. This is the way we should live. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may still what? See your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So that we should live in such a way that they really have nothing to accuse of, that they may make some things up. We can't control the lies, but we can control the truth. We can control how we live. But they're going to still try to accuse us for some wrongdoing. But he says, live such good lives. Are we resisting temptation? Are we living such good lives among those around us? Do we resist temptation? Number two, do we respect authority? The second way our integrity is going to be tested is by how we respond to authority. People in government, people in law enforcement, our bosses, spiritual authorities, any authority figure. How do we handle that? Verse 13, he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, notice, to every human authority. This becomes very interesting, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors, and the list could go on. Do we submit ourselves to every human authority? And the first thing we have to ask, I think, as we look at this, is what does it mean to submit? What does he mean by submitting? And just to notice right off the bat, he doesn't say to obey, he says to submit. Now, there are certain cases in the scriptures where God is commanding us to obey. Like children, obey your parents. You don't just submit, you obey your parents. But there's lots of, and to God, we're not just to submit to God, but we are to obey God. God says do something, we do it, we obey God. But there are places, many places in the scripture where we're called to submit. We talk about a husband and wife in Ephesians, there's to submit to each other. Not necessarily obey. Maybe we would like that, but no, to submit is different. We think about other places in the scripture that we're told to submit. How about the government here? He's calling us to submit. Or slaves to masters, to submit, not necessarily to obey, but to submit. But then children are to obey. So we have this difference between submitting and obeying. And really submit means to defer to yield to, or to listen to. It doesn't always mean to obey, but it means to defer to. means I'm going to give first preference to. I'm going to lean in this direction when it comes to authority in my life. Do we do this when it comes to authority? Remember, obeying is just like this radical commitment to do whatever God tells us to do. But submitting is to defer to lean in and to listen to, and to follow when we can, to do what they've asked when we can. This is generally what it means. And in our culture, in our day, in this country that we live in America, where we value, obviously, freedom and individuality and individual expression, maybe even to an extreme, for us, a word like submit is almost like a bad word, no matter where you're using it. And this is something we have to wrestle with as followers of Jesus in a culture in which we live in. And so going back to verse 13 and 14, he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. It means giving up our right to choose something different because we want it that way. When we submit to authority, it means we don't drive 85, 90, 100 miles an hour when the speed limit's 65. Now, for many of us, that's hard. Submitting means we wear a seatbelt because that's what the law says to do, even though we feel like we're Americans and we should not be forced to do anything. I don't want to submit. I don't want to. Does anybody struggle to, maybe this is too honest of a question. Does anybody struggle to wear a seatbelt because you're told to do it by the government? Yes, thank you guys. Okay, so some of us do struggle with that. But I still buckle up because we are submitting to government. How about garbage, trash? I mean, I've been in Cambodia where they would eat something and just dump the trash on the ground, and everybody did. There's trash all over the place, and never in my life have I more appreciated no littering signs in my life than when I went to Cambodia, because they had trucks at night that would literally drive through the streets, just like scraping the trash off the streets, off the sidewalks, off the ground, and it was a mess, and they could never get it off, and it was just trashy. And I came back to America. I thought, this is why we have signs, no littering, because we don't want to look like that. And so we throw our trash away. We submit to the rules because that's what we do as followers of Jesus. So the mark of a true believer is that we submit to authority. And it even goes into like every authority, even at work. We submit to our bosses. We defer to his way. We don't try and do what's opposite because we are submitting ourselves to our boss. As long as it's not going against what we believe, right? Something that he's trying to tell us to do something that would be sin for us, right? So there's certain places we don't obey, but for the most part, most of the time we're being asked to do something. We can submit. It's not about our way, it's about submitting to the way our boss, the person of authority, in the sphere of the authority that we're under to do what they've asked us to do. Same thing as a coach on a team or a player on a team. So he goes on here. And he says here in verse 14, he says, submitting ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor, to the supreme authority, or to governors. And he goes on, who are sent by God to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Now, this is what government's for. It's one of the reasons what government is for, is to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. And God has ordained government. You're right, he created government for a purpose, to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. That's one of the purposes of government. That's what it's for. And even bad government, even some of the worst government, is preferable to no government, to anarchy. And we've seen countries at different times in history have anarchy, which is worse than even bad government. So I think even bad government is preferable to anarchy. Romans 13 verse 4 says, for he is God's minister for good. The government is for good. They should be doing good. Government is necessary. If you've ever looked at a failed state, a failed country, and what it's like to live there where the government has collapsed, it is just mere chaos. And there's several that have been happening. And right now, I think we have basic anarchy in Haiti. And we have 2 H&I pastors in Haiti. I went to Haiti about 5 or 6 years ago. Don't get me right on the date. May have been a little bit longer than that. But I went to Haiti. It was rough then. And Pastor Leslie Bertrand, who's spoken here, I've been in frequent contact with him over the last couple years as they've been moving into this anarchy. And what we're seeing in Haiti is this escalating of gang violence. About 80% of the capital, Port-au-Prince, is ruled by gangs. Man, it is not safe. Many people are shut up in their homes and can't go out. Over 5.4 million people are in crisis, with nearly 6,000 facing starvation levels of hunger due to gang violence, inflation, and disrupted humanitarian aid. I mean, it is a bad place to live. And what he's done, he has an orphanage in Port-au-Prince, and he has taken those kids and have fled to the mountain where it's at least safer for them to be until some sort of order is restored. I mean, and anarchy is a scary place to live. And that's where Haiti basically is at. Can you imagine what it would be like to live with no government? What if there was no police that you could call? No firemen? No one to respond to your 911 calls? No one fixing the streets or bridges? No one providing clean water? Nobody enforcing basic traffic rules? Only gangs ruling the streets, murdering people without any restraint and no consequences. That's what anarchy is. A total collapse of the government. That is a bad position to be in. And so this is what I think what Peter's right about. It's better to have, I think, bad government than no government at all. Now, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, what is our reason for submitting to government is this: submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. This is the reason. I think this is something we have to keep our eye on, that we submit to authority not because we agree with the person, not because we like the person, but we do it for the Lord's sake. We do it as unto the Lord. Another place the scriptures talk about, do all things as unto the Lord. That's how we operate, for the Lord's sake. So we're not doing it for the person. We're not doing it because we agree with what they want to do or what they're doing. We submit ourselves to authority for the Lord's sake. Now, what's interesting, stay with me, guys. We're still waiting our way. We've not gotten to the most tricky parts of this, so stick with me. Nowhere in the Bible does God approve of a particular person. Nowhere in the Bible does God approve of a certain political policy or style of government or a certain boss's policies at a business. And so nowhere do we have this written down that this is the perfect government except for God's government, where he's the Prince of Peace, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and everything is done according to his will. That's the only perfect government. But God did establish government, and we are to honor it. Now look, he keeps on going here in verses 15 and 16. He says, for it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Now, people ask me from time to time, what is God's will for my life? Well, right here, he's given us his will. God's will is that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Don't use your freedom to do evil, right? Live as God's slaves. That's who we are in servanthood to. We are God's slaves. This is God's will, that we would live a good life. And as followers of Jesus, we should be like the most law-abiding citizens that there is. This should be us. We should be the ones willing to help our city and be the biggest, being most generous in trying to help and making our community better. Volunteering at the schools, making our schools better. Volunteering maybe at a homeless shelter or helping those who are homeless or hungry. We should be some of the first people to step up and do things like that. To maybe bring in foster children or help foster children or help foster families. We should be the best bosses out there. We should be the best employers and employees out there, because who God has called us to be and what he's called us to do good. And in verse 17, if he doesn't bring this home, he says, show proper respect to everyone. That leaves out nobody. He says, show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. He's going to catch it all here. Show proper respect to everybody. Love the family of believers. Hey, fear God and honor the emperor. Now, if we think we have it difficult to honor people in government, we just need to go back to Peter's time and realize what he was asking of them. The emperor at that time was Nero, one of the most violent emperors probably in Rome. This guy was insane. He was crazy. His mom got him into the position by knocking off his dad. Then he took the position. He was in that position as emperor about 14 years and then committed suicide. But early on, he knocked off his brother because he thought his brother would take his place, so he knocked off his brother, eventually knocked off his mom. I mean, he just started executing people that he thought were gonna take him off of his throne. I mean, he was a bad guy. And Peter is telling the believers at that time, respect the emperor, a man who called for them to worship him, that thought he was God. And Peter is saying, show proper respect to everybody, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. That's pretty amazing, I find, what Peter did and what he called them to do. And Peter was no stranger to, and he probably executed these people before Peter had written this. It was maybe after he wrote this that he blamed Christians for a fire in Rome. But either way, Peter knew evil government. I mean, he had saw Jesus, his master, the Messiah, be crucified by the Roman government. He had seen that stuff happen. He knew that Nero was corrupt. He was a savage murderer. And yet he says to honor him, submit. I mean, submitting now should be so much easier than submitting then, I would think. But when shouldn't we submit? This becomes the question we have to go to next, I think, is when do we not submit to government? I think there's pretty clear choices here. I think when government commands what God forbids, I think we can't submit any longer. Let me say, I can't do that. That God forbids me from doing that. Just because you're asking me, I can't submit to that, I will not do that. Or when government forbids what God commands. If a government would forbid that we would meet as a group of Christians to worship God, we would say we can't obey that. We're gonna meet anyways and worship God. So when a government commands what God forbids, or when a government forbids what God commands. And non-violently, we would resist and continue to meet, or whatever the case would be. And there's many examples of this in Scripture. One of them, probably the most well-known, is Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel is known to be a person who worships God, and so some of the leaders get the king to put out a decree that nobody should worship any other god except for the emperor himself. And Daniel knows that he can't obey that, so he continues to do what he has always done. And we see this in verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, that they weren't to worship anybody else but the king at that time, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows were open to Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. He said, I can't obey that. I'm going to continue to do it. And I wonder if maybe he opened up the windows just so everybody could see he was going to continue to do what he was going to do. And so that is an example. But it gets even more complicated than that. It isn't always so easy. It's not always a matter of civil disobedience, or civil disobedience is not always an easy matter. It becomes complicated about submitting. And there's lots of situations that aren't necessarily confronting a government with what we're allowed to do or not allowed to do, that is just maybe wrong or corrupt. And what do we do in those circumstances and situations? And I know the greatest example would be the American Revolution. And there's different sides, and this argument has been laid out many times before. But imagine that you were alive during that time frame, just prior to the American Revolution. And there were British soldiers that were marching up and down the streets. And they were taxing you and everybody else without proper representation and not knowing where the money was going to. That they were taking over people's houses in certain cases and taking over their property. They were holding secret courts, throwing neighbors in jail without due process, and some protesters being shot. How would you respond to that? Do you join the cause of the patriots and resist this government? Or do you just submit to the government? And this became where our founding fathers were at, and they were trying to figure this out, and they spent many hours arguing, wrestling, debating, searching the scriptures. What is our part in this? How do we respond? Do we just submit and let them continue to do this to us, or do we resist? And this is what they faced. And so who was right? Was it the loyalists that said, we're just going to do what the British tell us to do, or was it the patriots saying, no, we're going to resist? What's very interesting is that you had 2 great leaders at that time that had opposing views. You had John Wesley that would say, no, you should submit. The British are doing what they're doing is not right, and we don't agree with that, and what they're doing is wrong. It's ungodly, but the Bible tells us to submit, and you should just submit to the authority. And then you had his disciple, Francis Asbury, who really brought the Methodist Church to America, and he was saying, no, we should resist this. We should not allow this to go. We should not just submit to authority. So even they did not agree on the right approach. Of course, we know history. We know what happened. We're here, and the war was fought. And so they had to wrestle through this. And part of their line of thinking was this. They knew that it was forbidden to overthrow government, that anarchy was not an option, and that they were really opposed to anarchy. They knew that government was ordained by God, but they also knew that God ordained government to do good and not evil. And what they felt was they had a government that was doing evil and not good. And therefore, they had a case to not just submit blindly, but then to resist. They were resisting tyrannical leaders who were rebelling against God. This was part of their thinking. This is the way they reasoned it out. A second thing was a big principle for them was they would not fight an offensive war. It would only be defensive. They would never take the offense. They would be defensive. And they felt they had a right then to resist. And so this is the line thing. And even today, when you go to different pastors and Bible scholars, you still have these two options. Some people say, hey, we side with John Wesley. We think they should have just submitted. They shouldn't have done anything. And you got other good pastors, theologians say, yeah, Francis Asbury, we think he was right. They did what they should have done. And so still today, there is a disagreement on what was the right approach. This becomes part of the complexities of what does it mean to submit to government? And I wish I had a quick, easy answer for everybody to say, well, this is the right thing. But these are the things we wrestle through. These are the things we pray through. These are things we need to think about and say, where is that point? What does submitting look like for me? What does it look like for us? What does it mean to resist peacefully? And so these are all things that Peter was talking about, that our founding fathers thought about, that we think about, and we should think about today. Is what does it mean to respect authority? Now, I don't think we're to this point here, but at the same time, I'm not sure we do a good job at respecting authority right where we're at. Because we all have people that we disagree with and we don't respect them at all. So I just wonder, where does respecting authority start for you today? We're not talking down to this road where there might be a war on our hands, but how do we respect authority today, right where we're living in the situation of what we're living? And if we don't like what's going, how do we resist peacefully? How do we let our voice be heard in a way that is positive, that is constructive, and that is helpful to the community as a whole and not destructive? I think those are some of the things we need to wrestle through and pray through. All right, let's move on to something maybe a little bit lighter. How about, maybe not lighter, running to God in suffering? Peter talks about a third test of our integrity is how we handle suffering. One of the greatest tests of integrity is how we respond to suffering. And he talks about that here in verse 19. He says, for it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing what's wrong? If you have to endure it for doing what's wrong? He's like, that shouldn't be us. He says, but if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. This is what he's talking about. He's not talking about stupid things we do that get ourselves into trouble. We're kind of receiving suffering or persecution for that. He's talking about doing good and then suffering for doing the good. He said, to this you were called. Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Are we following in his example? Are we good at working through suffering? And then he goes on to talk about how Jesus did it. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. And when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he trusted himself to him who judges justly. When we're suffering unjustly, how well do we do at leaving it up to God to make things right? Maybe God never gets the opportunity in your case because you're doing it for him. That's our tendency as Americans. We want to jump in and fight the battle. We want to make it right. Somebody wronged me, I'm going to wrong them back. If somebody wronged me, I'm going to get some sort of revenge, some sort of repayment. When do we ever shut our mouths and just be quiet like Jesus did? He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. And when they hurled insults, when people hurl insults at you, do you retaliate? When he suffered, he made no threats. Do we make threats? Look what he did. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. When we're suffering unjustly, do we just submit that and trust that to God to see us through? Or do we try to fight back? So let me ask you a couple questions this morning as we get ready. Let's go ahead and stand up as we get ready to pray this morning. If we went to your work, what would people say about you? What would be the testimony that they have about you? Would they say that you have Christian integrity? They'll say, yeah, even when they're wronged, they keep this positive attitude and keep just moving forward and helping this workplace be a better place. What would they say about you? Let's take it a step further. What will be on your obituary when you die? What would be said about you? Would it be said that you are a man or a woman of integrity? Would it be said that you would resist temptation, that you respected authority, that you endured suffering like Jesus did? What would be on your obituary? I don't know if you guys know the story of Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Peace Prize, that his brother died. And the journalist that was writing his obituary thought it was him. And he wrote the obituary. And this is what he said. Alfred Nobel was an inventor of dynamite. He was a manufacturer of weapons, and he was a merchant of death. And when he woke up in the morning and saw his obituary in the paper and read that, he was shocked at how people saw him, how they viewed him. And it caused him to change his life and start working for good, to make a positive impact in the world and put his money behind it. And he started this Nobel Peace Prize for those that were making a positive difference in the world because he wanted to be remembered for something different. The question is, what will we be remembered for? And is that what we want to be remembered for? We have the option to change that. We can choose something different, what we're remembered for. To be a person of integrity, to be a follower of Jesus, to be somebody who resists temptation, that respects authority and knows how to deal with suffering when we go through it. Let's get ready to close in prayer this morning and take care of any business that you need to take care of with God, whether you come up to our prayer teams on either side or you come up to the altar, or whether you stay at your seat. What has God been speaking to you about as I've been talking? Is it a temptation that you're struggling with? You go, how do I resist this? How do I run the opposite way? Maybe you're under authority and the boss is not a good boss. You're like, man, how do I show respect in my workplace? How do I represent Jesus there even though I'm being wronged? Or maybe you're just going through a hard time. So I'm dealing with suffering and people have mistreated me and I have a desire to lash out of those who have hurt me. Let's just submit all this to God this morning and just lay it before his feet, knowing that he's big enough to take care of it.